I have a simple lesson this morning, I think, on a topic that hopefully we can all gain something from. I want to talk this morning about our confidence in God. And I have chosen a few examples throughout the Bible to look at. I want to start in Acts, the 27th chapter, um, to see how we see characters in the Bible and what they've done throughout time to show their confidence that they have in God. And hopefully that will help to inspire us to do the same. So, my first example is in Acts, the 27th chapter. We see this is when Paul is being taken to Rome. I want to read Acts, the 27th chapter, starting in verse 22 as we begin today. And now I urge you, take heart, for there will be no loss of life from among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God, that it will be just as it was told to me. So in verse 25, I see the confidence of Paul as he tells those who are on that ship that he believes God. So if we remember back, just a little bit of background on this story before we move on, but Paul's a prisoner. He's appealed to Caesar, and he's being escorted to Rome. Yet it's getting late in the year. They shouldn't travel across the Mediterranean at this point, and he warns the centurion who is over him about not going any further. But the crew has decided at this time that they would be better served to harbor in Phoenix, which is a harbor of Crete. We're told that in verse 12 at this time. But yet, so they take off, anyway, after Paul has told them that it's not a good idea. And now we see what happens as far as they're tossed in the sea. They've had to throw everything overboard. They've had to strap the ship together just to hold it to make sure that it won't break apart. Now there are several days, and they haven't even eaten. And it's at that point that we read in verse 22 about Paul telling them to take heart. And he tells them that in the confidence because he has seen God work in his life and he knows what God is capable of doing. So, do we have that kind of confidence in God? What is it that can give us this kind of confidence? And so, I want to go back to the Old Testament here next in 2 Kings chapter 5, and I want to look through several different stories in the Old Testament as many of us are studying that right now in our classes, and maybe take a different look at those as far as what those people did and the confidence that they had to do the things that they were able to accomplish. In the fifth chapter of 2 Kings, it's the story of Naaman. So I want to focus on verse 2 and 3, but it's important to understand that Naaman is a captain of an army, the king of Aram, but in the very last phrase, it says, but a leper. So in verses 2 and 3, we read of a young servant of Naaman's wife, and it says, and the Syrians had gone out on raids and brought back captive a young woman from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. Think about the confidence that this young girl had in God's power. And she's known of the prophet Elijah, and she knows that God is with him. And yet she was taken from her land, and she's placed as a servant to this woman. And she still is thinking about God and what he is able to do. It's at this point that I often wonder, you know, would I would I be thinking that way? Would I have those thoughts? Or would I be focusing on the sadness of the situation that I was placed in, the things I didn't like about where I was? Right? But she turns her confidence to God and the power that He has. And she sees the great power of God to heal at this time. There's another story of confidence I didn't really want to get into, but in the 6th chapter, when Elisha is surrounded by um, the Syrians who have come in, and at this time, his servant goes out and he sees that they're in dire trouble, right? And in the 6th chapter, in verse 17, it says, Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. That's confidence that Elisha prayed that this man would see what God was capable of. Yet, we should be able to see that every day in the word that we have in front of us. But next, I want to think about Jonathan and his victory over the Philistines, and that's in 1 Samuel the 14th chapter. If you want to turn over there, First Samuel chapter 14. It's in chapter 13 that we see that Saul has just been made king. He's only been there 1 year. And the Philistines have gathered themselves up against Israel. Saul himself chooses 3,000 men of Israel, it says in verse 2. But in verse 5 and 6, we see that the Philistines gather to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. So imagine that you go up against a force like this, knowing that you only have 3,000. They were scared. They were very scared, and yet Jonathan in the 14th chapter, beginning in verse 8. Let's read there. It says, Then Jonathan said, Very well, let us cross over to these men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say to us thus, Wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place and not go up to them. But if they say thus, Come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has delivered them into our hands, and this will be a sign to us. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, Look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes which they have hidden. Then the men of the garrison called to Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, Come up to us, and we will show you something. Jonathan said to his armor bearer, Come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hands of Israel. He predetermined what the trigger would be for him to move forward. And yet he had the confidence that God would show him the right thing to do. He stood up in the faces of um, being outnumbered, and he was willing to go in at this time, him and his armor bearer, against an entire garrison of the Philistines. So we see what great confidence that Jonathan himself has in putting his own life on the line to believe that God will deliver. So do we have confidence to even put our own reputation on the line at times? Not even our life, but sometimes we are asked to put things about our own reputation on the line and stand up and say things that aren't true, but they're more popular. Much less lay down our own life knowing that God is in control of what's happening. And it's this confidence that reminds me of the story in Daniel in the 3rd chapter of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So It's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. In fact, the book of Daniel is a great book. But in the third chapter, beginning in verse 12, we see the exchange, actually beginning in verse 8, we see the exchange that begins to occur between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and that of Nebuchadnezzar. So I want to start in verse 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O God, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them, saying, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made. Good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? How would we react at that point? What is our reaction when we are placed? I think I'm pretty safe in saying that none of us have ever been placed in front of one of the most powerful leaders in the world and told to do something that is against what God's word is. That's exactly what these three young men are asked to do. May not be young at this point, but these three men have been asked to do. And yet in 16 we see what their reaction is. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. The confidence to stand there and say, you know what, we serve a God that can save us because he created everything. But if he chooses not to, it still doesn't matter because we're not going to bow down to you. So the confidence that these men have in talking to the king, the way that they speak about God and the ability that he has, they hold to the faith that God has allowed them to be taken captive and that he has been with them and that they have risen to become leaders over provinces of the land. Yet, it seems that they haven't turned and determined that they did this on their own. Throughout the times that we're talking about in some of the classes, even was mentioned this morning in class, but how often is it that once we have accomplished something or risen to some point, and then what do? Have we put ourselves there? Is that what happened? Sometimes we forget. We forget that we prayed to God and we asked him to help us. We forget that we ask God for all of these things to happen around us, and then we say, well, great, I've made it here and I've done this all on my own. But that's not what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did, right? Do I begin to seek the Lord's will, but then when I get there, think that I did that all on my own? This story of confidence to me helps me to see that I need to put God, right, God's will as more important, right? We have confidence. Do we have confidence to God and to the point of death? And these men did. Now, these men were delivered, but it is important to see that even before they were delivered, it didn't matter to them whether they were delivered. Because what mattered to them was their confidence in God and them not doing what someone else told them to do because it was different than what God had said. In 2 Chronicles 20, we have another story of a king, King Jehoshaphat. 2 Chronicles chapter 20. And in verse 3, we see that he's faced with a situation that three different countries have come up against him. So, um, and in verse 3, I'm sorry, it says, "And Jehoshaphat feared and set himself to seek the Lord and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. So Judah gathered together to ask for help from the Lord, and from all the cities of Judah they came to seek the Lord." We see here a situation where the king is scared of what is going to occur. But then we have to ask, what was his reaction? And unfortunately, in this time, through many of the kings, they did not have the proper reaction. But Jehoshaphat here does. And beginning in verse 5 of chapter 20 of the Second Chronicles, it says, "Then Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord before the new court, and said, O Lord God of our fathers, are you not God in heaven, and do you not rule over the kingdoms of nations? And in your hand is there not power and might, so that no one is able to withstand you? Are you not our God, who drove out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel, and gave it to the descendants of Abraham, your friend forever? And they dwell in it, and have built you a sanctuary in it for your name, saying, If disaster comes upon us, sword, judgment, pestilence, or famine, we will stand before this temple and your presence, for your name is in this temple, and cry out to you in our affliction, and you will hear and save. And now, here are the people of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, whom you would not let Israel invade when they came out of the land of Egypt. But they turned from them, and they did not destroy them. Here they are, rewarding us by coming to throw us out of your possessions, which you gave to us, which you have given us to inherit. O our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power against this great multitude that is coming against us, nor do we know what to do, but our eyes are upon you." And in verse 13 it says, "Now all Judah, with their little ones, their wives, and their children, stood before the Lord." If you remember the end of this story, they don't even have to fight. In verse 24, it states that no one escapes. They have a prophet that stands up among them after that prayer and tells them that they're going to fight each other and they're going to kill each other. And Israel goes out the next day, and that's exactly what they find. As they look down into the valley, they find bodies everywhere. And it says it takes them 3 days to pick up the spoil from all of that. Yet Jehoshaphat stopped, and his confidence in God was to stop and to lead the people here and to pray. And so, do we have confidence that when we're in trouble, when we have difficulties, do we stop and pray? Or do we try to do something on our own? So, verse 12, obviously, there, for we have no power against the great multitude that is coming against us. Realizing their own situation, understanding where he is. But finally, back in the New Testament, what Paul wrote in Philippians, the 4th chapter. It's on the first slide, one that we all know. In chapter 4, verse 13, it says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. With the power and the might of God, why would we not have the confidence that's shown by the examples that we just read about? We say that we know that God is all powerful. We look around and we see the creation, and we know that He allows kingdoms and nations to stand at His will. Yet, sometimes I think personally, I don't believe that I show the confidence in Him that I should. You know, with His help, we can conquer a lot of things. We can conquer doubt, fear, depression, pain, loss, addictions, temptations, loneliness, and we can live a life of joy in serving Him. That's what confidence can give to us. In Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, beginning in verse 12, we read, Beware, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil heart of unbelief and departing from the living God, but exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ, if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. If we can hold on to the confidence that we had in the beginning, right? The confidence in God, the confidence that we had when we were baptized into the blood of Christ and we came out, and we know and knew then that He was able to protect us and give us all things that we needed. If we do that, don't you think our lives will be different? Confidence is something that's pretty simple, like I said in the beginning. To see some of these examples and to read about these, sometimes I think we separate ourselves and we say, yeah, but that happened then. But if we look at some of the stories and we see these individuals did not know what was going to happen next, right? We read it 3 verses later. That is not what happened, right? We ourselves today don't know what's going to happen next. Yet do we have the confidence that these individuals showed to always do the right thing no matter what the situation was? So at this time, we're going to offer an invitation. And that invitation is that if you haven't taken the steps that you need to be in the right relationship with God, you can do so now. If you need to get back into the right relationship with God so that you can have the confidence that you need, then you can come forward now. So this is a great time to come forward as we stand and as we sing.